good. So we're here, we're gathered on Zoom, myself, Jock Ireland, Brant Johnsue, and we're joined today by Karen Wilkin, who's very generously agreed to join us to talk about the Grief and Grievance exhibition at the New Museum. And this is all being facilitated by Rachel Bolander, who has taken the film of the show, filmed us at the show, who will edit our discussion and post it once it's all sorted. So this is an exhibition that is essentially the brainchild of a curator whose name I'm not going to try and pronounce right now, and someone else will do that for me. About the experience of the African American community in America, essentially, and a particular aspect of their experience, largely the mistreatment, mainly by police. And it's an exhibition that I honestly have a great deal of difficulty coming to terms with. I am enormously handicapped by the fact that I'm a white guy, an old white guy. So I feel very hesitant to kind of, begin to even express a response to it. It should be mentioned that what we are going to be, what we have in front of us are images of filmed images of works in the exhibition, but it's very important, I think, that the exhibition contains a range of works, many of which include sound. That throughout the galleries, it's virtually impossible to get away from the sound of one element in the exhibition or another. There are a number of video installations in the galleries that we are not going to be able to show. And some of those are very important. And to some extent, while we're kind of calling ourselves a sculpture forum, there is not a huge amount in the exhibition that would fall within, what I personally think of as, the tradition of sculpture as a language of things, physical things, finite physical things, stable finite physical things. There's a good deal more that seems to kind of live within the tradition of painting. But I was struck by the extent to which, in some ways, those traditional categories seem to be not comfortable for many of the people working that are included in this exhibition. Brant, at some time in a conversation following our visit to this exhibition, I think it was the next day, you said something to the effect that you thought this was going to be one of those exhibitions that in years to come would be seen as a pivotal or something or other, or something like that. You thought it would be, comparable to the When Attitudes Become Form exhibition or something like that. If I'm recalling rightly what you said.
Yeah, I think it's not as it doesn't have such a tidy occasion or a clean argument as those exhibitions that were more focused on art in its formal terms, but it has an enormous emotional wallop, and it's timely. It supplies you with things you need to think with. I don't think that it has a clear message, although it contains a fair amount of what could be called propaganda in the best sense. in some ways, it's a bit inartistic. But I think that the sort of the cumulative artistic emotional effect is, really quite overwhelming. And it's sort of like, it touches on the Aristotelian idea of the artwork being a kind of, I think in this case, not so much a purge of emotions as a kind of a goad. And some means, if not of clarifying thinking, of focusing thinking. So I found it really a kind of a startling and unexpected epiphany, because in part I've been a New Yorker and I've spent, well, more than half my life in neighborhood of color. So I was startled at how unfamiliar, in a sense, some of the feelings and ideas I had were, and they amount to recognizing that I've lived next door or beside a culture that's gone unrecognized as itself. I mean, at least in terms of visual arts. I realized that I'd been looking at a lot of things without being aware that they meant something in another language. And that was really unsettling and welcome.
That's very interesting. Thank you. I really appreciate that. That's enormously helpful too. Okay, Karen, I'm curious to know.
But I found everything Brent had to say very interesting and very accurate in terms of my experience also. I did find that the show was wildly uneven. And there were works that I was completely overwhelmed by. Other works that I found left me blank. And I was so struck by some of the artists who aren't there. You were speaking about sculpture. Martin Puryear is conspicuously absent. And I don't know whether it was because he was not asked to participate or whether he refused to participate. I keep thinking I should send him an email and ask him. Someone I might have expected to be there, although I'm certainly not putting her in the same category as in terms of the excellence and emotive quality of her work as Martin Puryear, is Chakaya Booker. In terms of painting, my good friend Enrico Riley, who has been painting highly charged paintings about Black experience, is not in the show. And I kept thinking as I walked through this about something that Enrico had said recently in an interview, where he said, yes, his work was about inequality and the Black experience and relationships with abusive relationships with authority. He said, but he also reserves the right to make work that is just about painting. And I found the most powerful works in this show work for me on both levels. And the ones I was less interested in were, as Brent says, propaganda in some ways. They failed in their other part. It's a powerful show. It's a show that I think we all need to see. Obviously, all of us discussing this today are outsiders, and we're looking at it no matter how many good friends we have, um, no matter where we live. Um, I live in a very, very racially mixed building. Um, it just happens to be that way. Um, does that make me a better viewer of this show? I don't think so.
Brant, you said something, if I can recall, about works being in a language which somehow or other meant something to another community. I mean, is that what you said?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've kind of lived in the middle of something that I didn't recognize for everything it was, which was really startling and kind of unnerving. I, you know, the Arthur Jafa video I saw last, and I thought it was really very powerful and really kind of put together and clinched the feelings that I'd had upstairs. And as an example of this thing that, you know, just don't recognize, I remember that there's, you know, all the clips are really brief and there's flashes of, you know, say, LeBron James dunking. And when I looked at it in terms of grief and grievance, I realized that this sort of like a victory anywhere, you know, like, you know, far from the scene of civil rights, say on a basketball court, nevertheless has this feeling, this expression of overcoming something massive and invisible, to recognize it happening in the past and in the present.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to the juxtaposition of that, the way that video was put together, that you were able to make those kinds of connections and it provoked those kinds of thoughts. I think that's, you know, very much the case.
But as I keep saying, I think the best art in any medium, including the best works here, do that. They don't have only one message. They don't sound one note. And which reminds me, I mean, there was that wonderful Robert Colescott retrospective, which I was fortunate enough to see before everything closed down. Colescott's not in this either. And his work functions on so many levels. I mean, it's angry, it's funny, it's magnificently painted. It's sometimes taking the whole history of Western art on and translating it into another Black language, literally.
Yeah, no, you're raising a very interesting question, I think, Karen. I mean, you know, the selection of work, obviously the show is not intended to be a kind of survey of, you know, African-American artists.
No, but it's intended as a survey of African-American artists who came to grips with certain issues.
Well, I mean, that does kind of, you know, I mean,
Well, when I referred to it as a bit inartistic, it's inartistic in as much as it was somewhat encyclopedic. I think it was not a survey. It was, you know, it was certainly thematic. I think that the show is, if anything, too large.
Yeah.
If it were just smaller, I think it could be more potent. That's simple.
Could be. could be. You know, the soundtrack or the soundtracks, as Garth pointed out, I found were almost physically uncomfortable. But I don't do well with very loud sounds anyway. Um, and it occurred to me that maybe that was part of the point, that we were intended to be
Yeah.
uncomfortable.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't know whether we were intended to be uncomfortable or not, but I agree. It was because obviously the sound could not be contained within any one gallery. You know, one found oneself looking at things and hearing something that was totally unrelated, and it did bother me.
Yeah, I agree with Karen that kind of cacophony of sound and making us uncomfortable with it was absolutely part of the show, because part of the African American experience is that you can never be comfortable. You know, you don't know when you're going to get followed because someone thinks you're shoplifting, or you don't know when the police are going to pull you over, and what would be routine for us becomes, you know, something very deadly. You constantly have to be thinking about where you are, your awareness of your surroundings, and you know, you can never be at ease. And yeah, I found the sound overwhelming because I was never able to really concentrate what I was looking at and look at the work. But you know, what if you had to live that way every day? And it was an important part.
Hmm.
Well, that suggests that the exhibition is intended to place us in the position of you know, as it were, one of these artists or a person from this community, uh, and make us feel in some way the way they are obliged to experience the world. Um, I did not understand or think that the exhibition was intending to place me in that uncomfortable position.
Uh, yeah, I mean, I don't think it totally cared what we got out of it. When I was going through it, I got very interested in the ages of the artists represented, in part because I think it was set up that this was a show for African Americans, about the African American experience, and particularly younger African Americans who may not feel that they are either represented or welcome in an art museum. And it was a way to say, like, we understand your experience and you can be here. And in fact, when we were there were a number of, much more than I see normally in New York, of younger African Americans at the exhibit. And that was good to see. I mean, if we do get something out of it and we do start questioning, like, you know, we do live in communities, how much do we understand that other language? How different is our own experience? That's, you know, in this exhibit is designed if we want to take the time to get that difference in experience.
Your point about the ages, I started noticing well. And there's the one piece of the three doors with the locks on the baseball bats. The artist is 20 years old. And I have no idea who that artist is or how the artist was selected. I mean, one of the things about this exhibition, as we know, is that the curator died. He highly, highly respected, very, very visible. And then a number of artists completed the show. He had apparently done most of the work on it, but I don't know how much was him and how much was later additions. I know Glenn Ligon was involved in the selection. It's all, you know, you're told all this. I'm not remembering it well enough. So this isn't one person's vision. It's in some ways a bit of a collective. And the fact that they brought it off at all in these days, I suppose, is something that one has to be grateful for. Any
Yeah.
exhibition that is completed and installed and that people get to see. And there are a lot of museums in this country that aren't open yet. So
Yeah.
we're very fortunate.
Yes, that's a very, very, very important what you just said, Karen. I think it is a significant achievement, regardless of in the circumstances, but in any circumstances, it's an important exhibition.
And any group show is an invitation for people to say, well, as I have, and I know there is nothing more irritating than someone from outside who tells people or asks questions about something that has clearly been thought about and worked over and has many reasons. But any group show is an invitation for this kind of thing. I mean, it's why the Whitney Biennial is impossible. And if you read the reviews of the old Whitney annuals going way back, exactly the same things are said. It's not representative. It doesn't show this. It doesn't show that. Nothing has changed.
Hmm.
I went to this not really knowing what to expect. I mean, I'd read the reviews. I found myself completely agreeing with whichever review, I can't remember now, who felt, as I think we all do, that the Jaffa piece was kind of, in a sense, it was all you needed. It said it all in a very eloquent
Hmm.
way. I was surprised by how deeply engaged I was by the show as a whole. I mean, there are certain artists that I have high admiration for and high expectations for, and I was, frankly, I was disappointed in the Henry Taylor. I think he's a much more powerful artist than the one work that represents him. There were people who, Latoya Ruby Fraser has been fascinating to me since the first things I saw of hers in a Whitney biennial many years ago. The Dawood Bays I thought were very powerful. There were also people that I hadn't paid much attention to, or I hadn't seen in years, and or didn't know about. And I'm actually planning to go back because I think I need to spend more time thinking about the people I don't know.
The
Right.
Jaffa piece was, though it's that video was really quite sculptural in some sense, because it was so much about the figure
Mhm.
and the body. I mean, the body in terms of something vulnerable, fragile, mortal, at risk, and the figure in terms of the body and movement, the body and among people. As a sculptor, I found it really moving.
I found it very moving. I felt watching it that I was in fact watching a dance performance.
Hmm. In some ways, it reminded me of William Kentridge's processions, and particularly I don't know how many of you saw The Head and the Load when it was performed at the Armory
No.
in 2019, which is, I'm a big Kentridge fan, but this is absolutely the best thing he's ever done. It was about the African porters in World War I who were conscripted and died in enormous numbers, totally unrecognized. And of course, because Africa had been carved up among the European countries, they were forced to fight for different sides. And it was an amazing piece with projections and dancers and actors, and had the same kind of celebration of the body in different guises, but as a live performance. And for me, the Japa had some of the same qualities.
Yeah, yeah. Jock, we haven't heard much from you.
Well, yeah, I'd been listening to interesting conversation. I had a little epiphany in front of the Adam Pendleton, the wallpaper in the first floor of the museum. I just started to think about Leonardo, not the Mona Lisa, but the guy who looked at plaster walls, stains on plaster walls, and saw things in the stains. And it occurred to me that the whole show was a sort of Leonardo-like show, as opposed to a Michelangelo-like show, in that it was a show about, well, Leonardo, I can think of him as a guy who looked at the world, looked outside of his own head at a world that was different from the guy he was. Whereas Michelangelo kind of created his world in his head. And I'm used to, and I think we all are used to, artists who create their own worlds in their own heads. Where, you know, that's sort of what modernism maybe is about. And this is a different kind of show. And but thinking about this, you know, very shaky Leonardo Michelangelo distinction helped me. This was a show about a world that is outside of us participants. Every artist is a mix of Leonardo and Michelangelo, but it was fun for me to think about each artist, you know, how much Leonardo is here and how much of the world is here, and how much of a sort of studio created thing is this. And so the exhibition was very important to me, and as Karen said, I'm going back. I'm not concerned about this being good or that being less good or whatever. I just want to be with this stuff.
I found that that my response to the show, I think in some ways was, well, I don't know if my response was effective, but I was certainly aware of the fact that I had spent a lot of time with the Alice Neel show, not long before seeing Grief and Grievance. And it was a very interesting combination. There's Alice Neel, as you know, lived in Spanish Harlem for a long time, and then moved to another part of the Upper West Side that was very mixed. And many of her sitters were people who were her neighbors. She was very much part of the Puerto Rican community by marriage, even though that marriage didn't last very long. And it was interesting to think about Neel as somebody who was white and middle class originally, who work in many ways was addressing many of the same things that these artists were addressing. What I found was that the individuals and personalities of her sitters came through so powerfully that it really took a physical effort to switch to looking at these things as paintings and trying to figure out what she had done. that kind of intensity, it seems to me, was part of what I was responding to in the works I found most convincing in Grievance.
Yeah, and the thing about Alice Neel is that sort of 20 years ago, or I mean, I remember her speaking at the studio school in about 1980, and sort of nobody took her seriously. She was an illustrator. She wasn't a real artist. But it's recently we're sort of opening up to this dimension of thing. You know, she wasn't a Michelangelo. She was interested in the world outside of herself, and
Absolutely.
It's interesting or fascinating to me that we're open to this now, and it matters to us now in a way that 40 years ago it didn't, or we sort of pushed it away, or at least I did.
But of course, even though ABEX was supposedly the official style that was receiving the international reputation, there were always potent artists who had rejected, not just Alice Neel. So some of them are still around. Lois Dodd, Robert De Niro Sr., Paul George has never painted like that. I mean, so I could keep going with this for a long time.
Yeah, and I mean, are we in danger right now because the whole of academia and the whole of the commercial art world has turned its attention to looking at the work of African Americans and promoting and enjoying the work of African Americans who have been so neglected. And I would like to talk a little bit. I would like us to think a little bit and talk a little bit about the Melvin Edwards sculptures in this exhibition, which I found refreshing in that context. Partly because they did not, they did not, to my mind, address the issues that were being focused on by a lot of the work in this kind of head-on way. They seemed dense, knotty, angry little, tangles of stuff that could be thought of as masks, possibly with some reference to African masks. Made up of bits and pieces of stuff, often including, things like nails and other objectionable, things that, I found the way in which those works allowed me to engage in a kind of contemplative, ruminative experience in relation to them, refreshing in this context.
Yeah, it's a Michelangelo, or Edwards is a Michelangelo-esque artist. He's someone you and I are familiar with. We know this kind of work. Graham Nixon is having a show up in Hudson, and he's got a sort of series of watercolors of two trees, one tree right in front of the other, overlap, I think is the name of many of the title of many of the sculptures, of paintings. But they're just like these Melvin Edwards, that small, congested thing that is terrific. But it's Michelangelo, it's not Leonardo. And most of the work in the show is Leonardo, is not created in the studio by sort of one artist, one in quotes, sort of genius. There's a, more often than not, there's a distrust of art in the work in this show.
Well,
I don't
no,
know about more often than not.
Okay. Oh,
In some pieces, I'll grant you that. I must confess, I had trouble with the Melvin Edwards because I've spent so much time thinking about David Smith. And my first reaction to them was very much like yours, Garth, sort of, now I can think about these in terms of sculpture and not in terms of systemic racism. The problem I had with them, besides their familiarity, was that the stuff out of which they were made, for me, very often announced itself too strongly. It wasn't subsumed by the whole thing. I think, I found some of them more engaging than others, but I can't, when all I can see is the hammerhead and think of it as a hammerhead, and not try to think of it in terms of, would not see it in terms of mass and form, I started thinking about Thornton Dial. And his big relief paintings, which are physically incorporating all kinds of stuff. I mean, you read these labels and it's, desiccated goat, repurposed jeans, barbed wire, you name it. And literally making his work out of the detritus of the rural African-American experience. But he so transforms it that they become something else. You can spend a lot of time and you can tease out, if you look hard, what's actually in there. Old dolls, flags, you name it. But that's not what they're about. That all gets transformed into something else. And it's that I understand exactly what you were saying about the Melvin Edwards, and I do respond to them. But I also get caught up in the parts in a way that I'm not entirely happy about.
Yeah, I think I might disagree with you, although I'm sure there are various degrees of what you're saying, Karen. I found the balance between the totality of these little objects and what they were made of, the ability to discern the parts separately from seeing the total was often something that I found worked quite well. But I take your point.
The last one that you just showed, I thought was one of the best because it was working on several levels for me. I thought that was one of the better ones as well. Where I was able to, it had, well, so I keep saying the same thing. It had levels of meaning beyond the history of the fragments.
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking that Melvin Edwards was someone who was able to embrace the tradition of welded steel sculpture and use it, in a very personal way. And in a way that did engage the experience of African Americans, that spoke to it very directly, and yet at the same time did not seem, as Jock was suggesting, to reject the idea of making things that extend the tradition, rather than break with it.
Yeah,
course, you could
I was suggesting that he's very much part of that. Melvin Edwards is a Michelangelo-esque, a modernist. He's the kind of artist that I've grown up thinking, that was what a real artist does. But I've sort of missed something, or there's, Garth, what do you think of the Rashid Johnson up on the 4th floor, the big set of shelves with plants on them mostly? That's not sculpture to me, or my first response to that is, I don't know how to deal with this.
Would you
But-
have to put a label on it? Do you have to categorize it?
Well, it was somehow comforting to me to think of it as Leonardo-like in
Oh, well,
that,
obviously, if you're confronted by this, why do you have to squeeze it into a category?
well, in order to embrace it, it's just a foreign thing, or at least it was a foreign thing until standing in front of the Pendleton downstairs. It occurred to me that there's something about Leonardo and Leonardo looking at the world that was outside of his head and being fascinated by it. And that, gave me a handle for this piece. I'm not trying to fit it into a category. I'm just trying to get a grip on it and understand why so much of the work in the show is different from kind of what I expect to see in a museum. And
Yeah,
So if you,
sorry, Karen, go ahead.
I was just going to say that if one wants to categorize the Rashid Johnson, I think it fits much more into painting than in sculpture, being about relatively flat expanses of different textures and what have you. Then you get up close, you start reading the details. I don't mean to dismiss your approach, Jock. I'm just that was one of the associations I had with it.
Mhm.
And of course, when you get up close and you read the titles of the books that he's included, they are all very important to the history of African American literature. There also some of the stuff there, the shea butter, which is an African import. I wasn't absolutely convinced that all the plants had that kind of connection. In fact, there were some that I have as houseplants that I know are not African. And some of those needed watering very badly, which was distressing.
Yeah, that was one of my concerns, was how we keeping the plants alive. But yeah, my experience of that work was complex and bewildering. I mean, I experienced it more like I was being asked to kind of read it.
Yeah.
It was like a book that was kind of open at all the pages at the same time. And in the end, I found it paradoxical and in some ways paradoxically unsatisfying, because it seemed to be tidying up in a very putting in very orderly way in these little boxes this very disorderly world.
It seemed like good stage dressing.
Yeah, well, I found it. In a way, I found it sort of puzzling and I mean, in a way unnerving, but in a way just annoying that this had all been sort of boxed up.
Yeah, there's a writer.
At least it didn't yell at you.
Yeah, there's a writer named Joseph McElroy, and he tweets occasionally, and he tweeted a picture of himself in his apartment reading a book. But behind him was something, I think, just a bunch of bookshelves. But the photograph left me wondering what they were. And I thought they might be a bunch of fish tanks. And McElroy is a very Leonardo-like writer, interested in water, and I just connected this piece with that photograph of McElroy, and it I don't know, it resonated. I recognize how sort of kooky this sounds, but I've been thinking about it for a week or two, or ever since we went to see the show, and it's not, or I've gotten over the annoying response, and I'm engaged with a kind of interesting mystery about it.
Okay, well, we've talked for about an hour. Jock, I think you're in some ways confusing me with Michelangelo and Leonardo, but at the same time, I take it that you are making a point that a lot of the work in this show is coming from a place and being made by people who cannot ignore the world outside them, and that we perhaps, or I perhaps, have the privilege and have had and have enjoyed the privilege throughout my life, really, of being able to shut the world out to some extent and think about it in a very abstract sort of way. And that perhaps, what I'm confronted with in this exhibition is work where that, from people where that is simply not an option, or not the same option anyway. So anybody else got any last words? Okay, thank you, everybody.
Everyone that feels they said I'm sorry too many times. You can go too far, but you can't come back home.